It's 1987, Atari tried to cling to life by releasing the 7800 in Europe. The ZX Spectrum Plus 3 model comes out, giving floppy disk technology to specky fans up and down the UK. And a new heavyweight hits the scene in the form of the Commodore Amiga, a 16-bit microcomputer that is about to take the world by storm. My name's Stuart, this is Generation Pixel, and welcome to the Pixel Years. Breaking news in 1987, Swedish furniture giants IKEA open their first store in the UK, probably not fully understanding that 30 years into the future, their Billy bookcases will still be lusted after by retro gamers all over the world. The designation 007 passes hands once again, this time to Welshman Timothy Dalton in the new movie The Living Daylights. And £1 million Operation Deep Scan fails to find Nessie because everyone knows Nessie is incredibly camera shy. And that is your breaking news in 1987. Hello friends and welcome back to the Pixel Years, and here we are in 1987 and you're about to have a feast of games that I played in 1987, some of the TV ads that were on in 1987, I'll look at some of the movies and even listen to some of the music. But let's get this show started with the first game, and that is World Class Leaderboard. Now I'm going to make no bones about this is going to be one of those guilty pleasure games, and actually looking back on 1987 there was quite a lot of guilty pleasure games, and the guilty pleasure in this case, well, it's obviously golf. And yes, I know, and you can put into air quotes here that sports games aren't for real gamers, and I'm not going to lie, there is a little bit of me in there that also sort of feels this. Now I don't want to say that anyone who's out there only playing the FIFA games every year or the wrestling games or whatever game, that you're not a real gamer. Well, of course, if you play video games, you're a gamer. But for a few of us out there that like to mix up the style of game we play, the genre of game we play, we often see the sports titles as lower class gaming. So for me, in my own mind's eye, yes, a guilty pleasure is a golf game. And it all started off with Leaderboard back in the 1980s, and of course eventually onto World Class Leaderboard in 1987. Now enough of the prattling on about what is and what isn't true gaming, and let's talk a little bit about World Class Leaderboard. So for the few of you who have stayed with this and have been watching this gameplay slowly draw itself in, you will notice it's not the fastest game to play, and I think that's one of the reasons that I keep coming back to not only this particular golf game but also golf games in the future. Now what World Class Leaderboard and Leaderboard in general had that was something a little bit special was all down to the limitations of the 8-bit machines they were running on. Now if you take a good look at the screen, you'll see there's very limited information on there for you. The screen shows you what hole you're on, what par that hole is, the distance from the tee off to the flag, what club you're currently using, your score, and of course the gameplay mechanics side of the game where you decide how much power you're going to use and how much hook or slice that you're going to employ in each shot. You don't see things like how far that club will actually hit the ball. No, you have to work that out yourself. Now in the instruction manual there is a guide to how far these clubs should be able to hit the ball, but the true professionals among us back in the 1980s, well, we learned those clubs ourselves. And for me, it was a simple trick of keeping in mind that the 7-iron could hit the ball about 140 to 150 yards. And that particular limitation that became a mechanic is what kept me interested in World Class Leaderboard. Now of course golf games have came a long way since the 1980s, but the solid programming in World Class Leaderboard will keep me coming back time and time again, even now in 2022. So if you're a fan of golf games or even just 8-bit micro history, World Class Leaderboard is one you should definitely dig out and give a try at least once.
Hey Ronald, where are you going?
To McDonald's. I've got to get there before Hamburglar. Or there'll be no hamburgers left for my friends.
Oh,
This is a shortcut.
This is the shortcut, Ronald. Rubble, rubble.
where's Hamburglar then?
Looks like he's cut and run.
The second game we're going to look at today is another ZX Spectrum game, and it is Match Day 2. Yes, it is another sports game, but I did warn you early on that 1987 was a bit of a guilty pleasure year. And not only that, in the 1980s the arcade was king, and the arcade was a social event. It wasn't somewhere you went alone, you went with your friends, and at home you wanted to replicate that experience. And the best way to do it was often a sports title. Unfortunately, however, the same reason that most of us run to the house when we see a sports game these days was an all too present issue back in the 1980s as well, that being that sports games are often generic tripe that aren't worth your time or money to play. And despite putting an obscene amount of time into Match Day 2 back in 1987, I can only say that with much regret. Because even with the low expectations that I have these days of sports games, Match Day 2 was not good by any stretch of the imagination. In fact, I would go as far as to say that its predecessor Match Day was a far superior game. But of course, video games were new and shiny back in the 1980s, and you wanted sequels, you craved sequels. We were all dying to see what the next graphical improvement would be, how well the sound would be implemented, and always live in hope that the gameplay would be improved as well. But probably the best thing that I can say about Match Day 2 is that the graphics were slightly improved, but only when it came to the player characters. Now you're probably looking at the gameplay and saying, it's just a bunch of cloned bobblehead freaks out in the pitch, but that was a dramatic improvement back in 1987 over Match Day. Unfortunately, as I've said, the gameplay wasn't improved in the slightest. The sound, well, on the ZX Spectrum, the sound was never going to be something spectacular anyway, so on the whole it was quite a disappointment at the time. You had, however, spent your hard-earned pocket money on this game, so you were damn well sure you were going to squeeze out every drop of enjoyment that you could, even though there was very little enjoyment in there to squeeze. So I wouldn't recommend that you go back and play Match Day 2, I would recommend that you go back and play Match Day. But in 1987, this was a must-have game, and it was also a clear indicator of where sports games were heading, which is quite clearly a succession of pumped-out sequels and yearly add-ons that make no difference to the game.
Decepticons are attacking our launch site. Where's Prime?
He's on Cybertron. It's up to you, Ultra Magnus.
Autobots, transform and motor!
When Ultra Magnus rolls into action, he takes on Decepticons.
Meet Ultra Magnus. He can transport 4 Autobots into battle, but once there, he transforms into my powerful Autobot commander.
The Transformers.
Robots in disguise.
The Transformers, sold separately from Hasbro. And coming this summer, Transformers the movie.
You've never seen anything like it.
Third up for the video games that took all my time in 1987, we have Fruit Machine Simulator. Okay, so I solemnly swear that this is the absolute last guilty pleasure game on this video. And without a shadow of a doubt, Fruit Machine Simulator is definitely the most guilty of the guilty pleasures of the games I played in 1987. Because who in their right mind, well, obviously with the exception of Codemasters, would think a slot machine simulator was a good idea for the ZX Spectrum, an 8-bit microcomputer that tended to reside in the bedrooms of teenagers all across the UK. But of course it was Codemasters, and they did release this game, which is essentially nothing less than a software equivalent of a gateway drug for gambling for young teenagers in the UK. Well, I'll be frankly honest with you, gambling has never really been my thing. I'm quite fortunate that way, but I absolutely loved playing Fruit Machine Simulator. And despite it being a budget title from the almighty Codemasters, it did run really well. And not only that, when I did reach the ripe age of 18 and was allowed to frequent public houses where these real gambling machines were held, I already had a solid foundation in the workings of these machines and a head start on the competition. Well, so you think, but kids, gambling never pays, the house always wins. But the game itself is quite fantastically programmed. It wasn't just a simple one-armed bandit simulator. It elevated this genre of gaming onto a completely different level. Previously, these slot machine simulators were just very simple games. One button to start spinning the reels and hope you get a winner. What Fruit Machine Simulator did was emulate the little mini games that you saw in these gambling machines all across the country. Now, as I said at the beginning, gambling has never really been my bag, and that's because I'm quite a materialistic person, and if you ever look at my gaming habits you'll see that too. I will always choose physical over digital because I like something in my hand. Quite simply put, my thoughts on gambling, it's like putting money in someone's hand and getting nothing back in return. or no guarantee of something back in return, but put it into game form where I'm not winning actual money, but I'm scoring points, getting on a leaderboard. That's exactly where I want to be. So if you've got a few minutes to spare and you want to burn some time without burning any real cash, then you could do far worse than Fruit Machine Simulator from Codemasters back in 1987. Next up, for the video games that stopped me from going outside and playing with my friends in 1987, we have Salamander. Now, all the games that captivated me in 1987 weren't all guilty pleasure games, because here we have Konami's 1987 release of Salamander, or Lifeforce depending on which part of the planet you're actually from. Now, shoot 'em ups were never my go-to genre, but when it came to horizontal shooters I did have a holy trinity. 3 games that I absolutely loved and spent an absolute fortune on in the arcades, and one of them of course was Salamander. The other 2 being the fantastic R-Type and the almighty Defender, my number 1 all-time favourite horizontal shooter. Now of course, shmups as we like to call them these days have come a long way since 1987, but with the likes of Salamander you could definitely see where things were heading. No longer was it just a simple case of travelling along the horizontal plane and shooting your way to the end, because as things evolved you had to collect power-ups. If you didn't shoot the right enemies in the right order and get the right power-ups, you were going to struggle quite badly as you moved along the game. Now obviously Salamander wasn't unique when it came to this, and games moving forward would all adopt this, especially in the shoot 'em up genre. But what I truly loved about Salamander was the atmosphere. Yes, it was science fiction, but it was also horror. The environments that you travelled through while playing Salamander were nothing less than grotesque. Oozing, pulsating, living walls would stretch out at you, tentacles grew out of the floor and ceiling, and the world would morph in ways that would come together and create such a fantastic sense of claustrophobia. And of course, being a shoot 'em up, you had to shoot your way through waves upon waves of enemies as well, which made Salamander a unique and fantastic experience at the time. Now I know shoot 'em ups aren't for everyone, and even myself, I moved away from this genre a long time ago, but anyone with an interest in the genre or video games in general should go back and take a look at Salamander. Just don't expect to be very good at it, or at least be prepared to spend a healthy amount of time practicing it before you make any real progress. And if you take a look at the gameplay that I'm showing you just now, you can see just how much I'm struggling with this game. The almighty Salamander, aka Lifeforce from Konami in 1987.
Shoot to kill, we come in peace, shoot to kill, Scotty, beat me up. It's working.
Welcome to the jungle, it gets worse there every day. You learn to live like an animal.
Never gonna give you up, never gonna let you down, never gonna run around there.
The masked racing team is here.
Wildcat to Meteor, come back.
Roger, Wildcat.
I've spotted the Venom Buzzard, and I'm in pursuit.
On my way, Clutch.
Looks like company, Max. Buzzard, detach. Wildcat convert, trouble ahead.
Coming soon, Wildcat, Buzzard, and Meteor each sold separately. Meteor closing.
You're outnumbered, Max. Meteor, release. Time to change the odds.
Mask. Reillusion is the ultimate weapon.
The last ZX Spectrum game we're going to look at today is the almighty Gauntlet. When I said earlier that the social aspect of the arcade meant that you were looking for multiplayer games and you tended to have to go to the sports games for that, well, there was one big exception, and that was Gauntlet. But rather than what the sports games were offering, what you had here was a cooperative game. Now in the arcades you could have up to 4 players playing Gauntlet, which was a fantastic experience, but on the ZX Spectrum, well, unfortunately that was limited to 2, but being able to play a cooperative game on the ZX Spectrum was nothing short of miraculous. And then when you take into consideration that Gauntlet is a wonderful top-down dungeon crawler run and gun mob fest, the mere fact that they managed to get this game running on the ZX Spectrum, and not just running on the ZX Spectrum, but running well on the ZX Spectrum, is absolutely phenomenal. Now of course there was some very clever programming went into the game to get so many sprites on screen at the same time and have the game run as smoothly as it did, which is why Gauntlet on the ZX Spectrum has stood the test of time. Now there are some other considerations to take into account when you're talking about Gauntlet on the ZX Spectrum, especially when it comes to the 2-player mode. Now you probably already know that the ZX Spectrum was a microcomputer, I do bang on about it enough, and as such a joystick input was optional and it wasn't usually the number one choice. A lot of ZX Spectrum players played on the keyboard. And let me tell you, playing a cooperative game with even just one other player on the ZX Spectrum, meaning 4 hands on that tiny little keyboard, well that was almost a skill in itself. It looks wonderful, it plays beautifully and has aged like a fine wine, so if you get the option to play Gauntlet in any other system other than the arcade, then without a doubt you don't need to look much further than the ZX Spectrum port. But just remember, it is a cooperative game, not a competition game. If your compatriot is running out of health, we'll let them get to that food source because nobody wants to hear "Warrior is about to die." Not that you would on the ZX Spectrum anyway, but you know, you get my point. And that is Gauntlet on the ZX Spectrum in 1987. So that was 1987 through the eyes of yours truly, and now it's your turn. Drop down into the comments and let me know what you thought. Were you around in 1987? Do you wish you were around in 1987 if you want to talk about any of the games, the movies, the music, or even the news? Then drop that all down in the comments. Thank you very much for watching as always, and until we meet again in 1988, cheerio!
Hello.
Mike, I hear you got one of the new Commodore Amigas.
It's printing the club newsletter right now.
So you have time to talk.
The Amiga has multitasking, Jack. While it's printing, I'm working on my video.
Your video?
Well, sure, I've got it hooked into my VCR. I've got myself animated over taped images.
Nice music.
4-track synthesizer, stereo sound. Try that on your monochrome Mac, Jack. Jack?
The new Commodore Amigas. Only Amiga makes it possible.